Hi, I'm Lieutenant Colonel Tony Schaefer, the president of the London Center for Policy Research. We're here today for a very special thought to action, one which I'd like to believe is going to be grounded in reality and lay out some things that we all must be thinking of, no matter how we feel regarding Ukraine and Russia. And if you like our content, if you enjoy our shows, please subscribe, please comment, please share, please ring the notification bell. Also, follow us on Facebook, LinkedIn, Twitter, Getter, all the social media. And obviously, if you subscribe to our Patreon, you get our special behind the scenes content, and you get to participate in our Ask Us Anything, which is much like today. We're going to be going through and being very nitty gritty on things you need to know. So without further ado, let's get going. We have our board member and one of the my favorite people, because he's been a friend and mentor to me of mine for years, Ambassador Hank Cooper, who ran the Strategic Defense Initiative under President Bush, and before that worked for President Reagan. We have Jay Homnick, Senior Fellow at the London Center, who is very much into the issues relating to the Middle East and trying to find a path to stability for the world. Navy Captain Pete O'Brien, Distinguished Fellow. Pete and I have worked together, sometimes knowingly, sometimes unknowingly, for the past 30 plus years. So it's always good to have someone who understands from being involved, from being a very young ensign all the way up to being a captain, Navy captain. And then Bill Henselman, who is here for comedy relief. No, Bill is a former Marine Corps infantryman who is now very much into the technology sector and very much a part of our team to essentially give us a great deal of understanding of the current situations as they are, not that we want how we want them to be. So here we go, gentlemen. I just want to open this up. Oh, I got to say this. One last paid advertisement, Teespring. We have a Teespring store now that we're monetized on Facebook. Be sure and check us out for content. All right, back to the show. So one of the things that I've seen, I was up till 2 o'clock in the morning last night reading and watching all of the things that are going on. And notable to the situation, I keep picking up something from the left and from some of our own side, to include some very prominent former Bush officials saying that what is going on right now in Ukraine is quote unquote unthinkable. Well, clearly it's thinkable because people have been talking about this as strategic leaders for decades now. I mean, literally for decades, for 2 decades, since essentially Boris Yeltsin was in power and Putin was his deputy. Moving fast forward all these years and all the other indicators. So clearly this was thinkable. They missed that. And the other thing I've heard from a lot of folks, especially on the left, trying to defend Biden's policies, which are, as Ambassador Cooper will probably talk about a little bit, more focused on seeking peace rather than attempting to negotiate from a position of authority, which we'll get into. People keep saying that, quote unquote, it's unnecessary. Look, Putin apparently thought the invasion was necessary or else it wouldn't be happening. And I would argue this is more of an indication of complete inability of an analyst to include some pretty big names to understand Putin rather than to believe somehow this is unthinkable. To believe this is unthinkable requires you to detach yourself from the reality in which we live, because it's thinkable, it's happening. And I love this one. This has been a big one lately. Putin is insane. Putin is not insane. He may be a bit of a madman by the fact that he's doing things that we in the West consider unthinkable, but in his world, they are not. So this is where I think it's important for us to frame this in a realistic, very practical, this is what's going on. This is what you need to be prepared to do based on his actions, his perceived intentions, and the reality of which Putin functions in, not the world of Western media, Western pundits who would sooner talk out of their ass rather than trying to actually put some thought into what's going on and why it's going on. So that's it. That's why I want this to be something that we get into. So the reason we're here, we want to talk about infrastructure. We want to talk about what we could expect and how we should prepare for a potential attack against our infrastructure, the grid. One of the things that was known during the Cold War was that things like high altitude nuclear blasts were a real threat to infrastructure. Starfish Prime taught us this in 1962. You can Google it. Starfish Prime was a high altitude, I believe it was a small, Hank can correct me on this, a hydrogen bomb. I'll let him go through it, which was detonated over the Pacific. So that's where we're going to start, is what we know about EMP, what we know the effects would be, and then would someone like Putin consider using it based on the fact that he said he would use it? Should we take him at his word? So with that, without further ado, Ambassador Cooper, Hank, would you please kind of set the stage for us and how we want to talk about this?
Well, you mentioned several things, Tony, that I'll reflect on. In 1962, I was working at Bell Telephone Laboratories on our first telecommunications satellite. And Starfish Prime went off, and the radiation that was released from that explosion in the South Pacific knocked out Telstar and a large proportion, if not all, of our other rather limited satellites that were then in orbit. So one of the things that's at risk from a high altitude explosion of that sort are our telecommunication systems that can go out. We learned that the hard way, and everything became super classified because all of our military systems, as well, of course, as our civilian systems, were vulnerable to the effects of a high altitude test. That was a 1.4 megatons, as I recall. So it was a large yield. On the other hand, we know from physics work over the decades since, you don't need that large yield. A small yield weapon, even 50 kilotons, which is still pretty big as compared to what we saw at Hiroshima and Nagasaki. They were 13 and 18 or 20 kilotons.
Right.
And they destroyed entire cities. The storm in Hiroshima actually caused more deaths and damage than did the nuclear explosion. So, and those are the two cases that we've had of direct evidence, and people went there, studied it hard. I knew many of them. Paul Nitze led the negotiations that I was a part of during the Reagan years, and before actually as well. And we worried about these issues explicitly with the Soviets, talked about them. They well understood these issues. We wanted to build defenses because one other thing that happened in the early 70s is we made it a legal matter for us not to continue with the defense systems that actually I had begun working on in the 1960s, called the Nike Zeus, Nike Hercules system. And the Soviets never backed off from their efforts in that area, but we did. And today we have no serious defense of the United States. We have limited defenses against North Korea and perhaps Iran, although I would question some of that. Some of the systems we began building on my watch with SDI have some capabilities, but because of the political scene, we've never built the most cost-effective defenses because we relied on mutual assured destruction. It has an interesting acronym, MAD, which is what I consider the strategy to be, that says that we're most safe when we're most vulnerable. I don't believe that the Russians buy that idea a bit, and that's based on my 5 years of negotiating with them directly. Mm-hmm. So I think we are in a situation where we have few leaders, if any, in this administration that appreciate the issue. They're counting on sanctions. Sanctions have never worked that I know of. Maybe a penalty afterwards, but as a deterrent. Even Biden, after the fact, admits that they have never worked. And yet that's still all we're talking about. I don't think Putin gives a hoot about sanctions. So if we're trying to deter Putin, we should be thinking about things that might matter to him.
Exactly.
I believe is things that could, in fact, harm him, frustrate what he's doing. And he's not only working on high explosive tests and the possible use of nuclear weapons. As I understand it, he's employing thermobaric weapons as well. Most people in this country don't even know what they are. And we did research on them back in the 70s and 80s. And they are quite capable of sucking the oxygen out of the atmosphere, and creating conditions that fire dominates. And the war he's fighting right now on the people and the cities is handmade for that kind of a threat, which does not cross the nuclear threshold, which I think we will not cross ourselves. And if we do it foolishly because we're unprepared for the consequence of that. So, and when I say unprepared, I don't know anybody in this administration that has 2 cents worth of wit about the issues I just summarized.
So, yeah, Hank, thank you. So one of the things we mentioned in the pre-discussion before we got this going was, as you mentioned, past is prologue. It's to quote Yogi Berra, it's deja vu all over again, where you have essentially the Democrats leading and profoundly, I think, misreading the situation by going down the same path Cy Vance did. Cy Vance being the Secretary of State for Jimmy Carter in the late 70s, where they attempted, again, appeasement and negotiation as a method of trying to dissuade the Soviet Union. And is that an accurate kind of very quick summary of the Carter perspective on things, Hank?
Yes, it is. That's what Reagan inherited and immediately changed the name of the game.
Right.
He deployed the INF missiles to counterbalance SS-20s that the Soviets were then deploying to threaten the countries of Europe beyond NATO at the time, and which we had no accommodation for. And when we deployed our own INF missiles, especially the Pershing II missile, which could range Moscow in 20 minutes, I think it was, directly, Soviets walked out of all the talks. Everybody was all up in arms about all that, but it was the right move. And in fact, they came whimpering back to the talks after the election of 1984 that brought Reagan back into office, while they were trying to block him at every corner. That was a political move he made, the Soviets made, where they went against all of the nations, 5 nations where we were deploying those INF missiles in Europe. And one of the high points of NATO is when we stood together in those days. I don't know that we have a shadow of that background and experience in NATO today either to stand up.
So I want to hit that NATO point in a second, Hank. That's one of the things I wanted to add to our discussion this morning. So that's the framework we have, gentlemen. We face a situation which is in many ways analogous to the 70s, in many ways different. And I think that's the challenge of anyone who's actually studying the path forward. Just so to Hank's point, Hank's laid out the history. Now we have to go into the technology just a bit. As Hank said, this technology, the idea of using high altitude nuclear bursts, I think would cause far more damage to our infrastructure and our ability to both live as a free people and act militarily when necessary. These things are something that we become completely dependent on. From Elon Musk's satellites that provide internet, this entire new Starlink system, which is really putting people on the internet in rural areas, which I would argue is hugely vulnerable to high altitude nuclear bursts, all the way up to all of our GPS. Boy, I don't know of anybody right now who can navigate well, to include myself, without GPS. These are all things which we depend upon. And oh, by the way, FedEx, UPS, all these other major logistics companies use this as well. So let's get into the technology here a little bit. And I'll turn to Pete O'Brien. Pete, someone who has worked this as an intelligence officer, as someone who's been a planner, as we talk about, to call each other on the black operations side, as a planner on the operational aspects of what we're talking about here. How do you see the current situation regarding this Russian capability to do something, the technology available to them, and what Putin's saying?
I think it's important to essentially roll back to one of your starting points here. Putin is not insane. Putin is a rational decision maker, and a lot of people will balk at that, and I'll push right back. Putin is rational. Lenin was rational. Stalin was rational. Hitler were rational. These are rational people. They're not insane. They're not crazy people who wake up in the morning and say, "I'm going to have marmalade with my toast, or maybe I'll invade Poland." They don't do that. That's not what's going on. This is cold, cool, heartless thinking about what they want and how they're going to achieve it. And when someone like Putin looks out and sees the United States as a threat to him, he looks at his full range of options as to how he's going to deal with the United States. One of those options is, as the ambassador just discussed, is the use of electromagnetic pulse to tear apart our infrastructure. And people need to understand what's going to go on here. Simple things like your money machine, your ATM, gone. Most of our modern cars will not work. Your elevators will turn off. Things like the SCADA systems, which operate the electric power system, the water systems, the sewage system, the big cities, all those kind of networks and systems, those are all controlled by relatively straightforward software on what are now basically laptop-sized computers, and all of those are going to have trouble. Many of them will be destroyed by an EMP event. And that means all those things just turn off. What happens in New York City if there is no water coming in, no sewage going out, and all the elevators are turned off, and all the buildings are dark? Think about that for just a minute. Think about how many people live above, let's say, the 20th floor in New York City. What are you going to do with those people?
Yep.
That is one simple element of that problem. And when you start looking at all the possible outcomes of an EMP, the results could be damn near catastrophic. Estimates vary, but have run as from anywhere from 10% to over 50% of the population could be at risk right, as in possibly dying as a result of an EMP. And I would also add, though, there is merit to addressing this issue beyond simply addressing folks like Vlad Putin or Emperor Xi, is that the sun can do this to us as well. Coronal mass ejection, the spitting out of hot gas from the sun, which takes place every now and then, every couple of days, most of them miss the earth, thankfully. But every once in a while, one does make contact, and it will do the exact same thing that an EMP will do.
Yeah, Hank?
Tony, let me add a thought to these. Bear in mind that a high altitude explosion over the center of the United States would shut down the electricity through all the nation.
Right.
And so imagine life without electricity in the United States. In the late 90s, I guess it was, Roscoe Bartlett, a congressman from Maryland, learned about these issues in discussions with Soviet generals and so on, and the fact that they planned to attack us this way as a prelude to any war that they would start with us. And he led to the Congress to instituting an overall commission, shorthanded the EMP Commission, that met several times over the following decade, looking at this issue in some detail. Their judgment was that the vulnerabilities in our existing electric power grid were such that a single burst or a few bursts over the United States at high altitude could shut down the entire electric power grid indefinitely, many months at least. Imagine life with no water and sewage, as just was pointed out by Peter, and no other activities. Their judgment was that up to 90% of the American people would die from social disharmony, disaggregation, unrest, and just inability to survive.
Right.
under those conditions. We're totally unprepared. Once upon a time during the Second World War and even afterwards, the Defense Department had a civil defense department. We disaggregated that. Also, as I recall, around the Carter years, but I'm not certain whether that's when it started. And it went into an organization called FEMA, Federal Emergency Management Agency, now which has, in addition to worrying about civil defense concerns, allegedly, floods and all these other matters that we face all the time. And they're probably doing good work, but they're not paying attention to this problem at all. So we have an existential threat that not only Russia can pose, but this EMP threat is announced in the military doctrine. That's not speculation.
Right.
The military doctrine of Russia, China, North Korea, and Iran. These are 4 adversaries that threaten the existence of the United States. Meanwhile, we have been sitting on our hands for 15 years after the first EMP Commission report, actually a little longer than that, to the Congress and publicly, and it's available on their web, and I can make this available. You might include it, all their reports on this matter. But the energy companies are not paying any attention to it. We have no organizational response to it in the federal government. Donald Trump issued an executive order, and Ron Johnson, the senator from Wisconsin, who was chairman of the Homeland Security Committee at the time, offered an amendment that passed to the Defense Authorization Bill, and I guess it was 99 or maybe it was 2000, that made the Trump initiative the law of the land, which still exists, and says the White House is supposed to be organizing the federal government to deal with this. It isn't. The Secretary of Energy, in her confirmation hearings, acknowledged this was a problem, and in particular, the distribution grid that delivers electricity to almost all Americans in their support infrastructure in the nation, and it is completely vulnerable to this threat. She acknowledged that explicitly in the hearing and elsewhere, and is doing nothing in the Department of Energy. So we have a federal government that is paying no attention to this problem. There are initiatives at the local level that are trying to work the problem from the bottom up, but without any help from Washington.
Well,
So,
let me make a point.
1 second, Jay. 1 second, Jay. I'll let you go next, but I just want to put one more thing in there. So to help understand what Hank just said, there's a book that was written by Bill Forston back in the 90s called 1 Second After. I highly recommend it. Bill actually worked with Bob Scales, Major General Scales, former commandant of the War College, regarding the technical data and understanding. So, and I spoke to Bob and Bill both about this. If you want to understand, it's fiction, but if you want to understand what it would be like to try to come back from an attack that took out the infrastructure, I highly recommend you look at that. So I'm sorry, Jay, go ahead.
Yeah, I want to propose that this way of looking at things. Let's discount the whole idea of people dying from it. Not only not 90%, but not even 10%. Or let's say everyone stays calm and we all have great, civil unity and we're handling. But the fact is that this will disrupt our ability to really mount any kind of concerted resistance and certainly not an offensive. It'll keep us completely occupied with trying to solve our own situation. And the fact is that we probably would not do the mutual assured disruption of doing it back to them. Because at the end we'll say, listen, what the hell, what are we causing them trouble for? Let's figure out our own thing first. So, but even let's say we do it. Let's say we even do the mutual assured disruption and we do it back to them. But we still have to deal with this. And the fact that it's not nuclear means that it's not violating any treaty. You know, it's just it violates the international norms, etc. But that stuff is not, you know, binding in any serious way. So the genius of doing it is that Putin could say, "Hey, I'm not breaking the nuclear deal. I'm staying within the nuclear rules. This is another thing, you know." And so that, I think, by the fact that we never included that into the same deals as the nuclear, we really shot ourselves in at least the foot, maybe higher.
So yeah, Jay, to that point, one of the things that we're members of was the G Forum. Probably remember early when I was after I joined on, there was a brief with your colleagues which talked about the Russians going to, I think it was fifth generation nuclear weapons, where the Russians had been preparing in detail in this is what, about 2000, 2008, 2009, right before I worked for you on the other project, where he walked through, I wish I could remember his name, but he'd been able to get information from the Swiss about the details of the Russians developing their next generation nuclear weapons, and we weren't doing anything because it was against the treaty. To Jay's point, they had the political will back then to start breaking treaties. We did not. So I guess I put that to both Jay and to you. It's like, how is it that we lack a sufficient understanding of facts that we may not be willing to act with the political will to prevent or prepare for this? How is this possible, Hank?
Before you go, Jay, let me just say that in the 1960s, I was an Air Force lieutenant working on the Minuteman system, Minuteman III, which is deployed today to protect it against nuclear weapons effects. After Starfish Prime that we mentioned, it became such a highly classified matter that the public didn't know. I couldn't even tell my wife what I was working on in those days. That system is still our ICBM system today. We're talking about improving it today. The Soviets are several generations beyond that. We are not spending the money to assure our strategic systems are viable. And we're playing catch up on the hypervelocity threat, which was also one of the things we worked on when I was director of the SDI program and led the technologies at the time. So we're now playing catch up in areas that we once led and where the Soviets, the Russians, I'm sorry, actually have deployed capability today.
So let's bring Bill in. So Bill, you've been listening to all this and clearly you have a big concern. Is Putin doing a thermonuclear lap dance with nuclear weapons right now? Is he just teasing, or is he actually considering doing something? What's your view of how we should look at planning to respond based on the technology, the capacity, and the intent?
So to your point of Putin not being insane, right? He's keeping all of his options on the table. They didn't spend billions of dollars developing these things to look at them on the shelf, right? And to just not factor them into their planning, right? He's not insane. He's calculated. He can do this anywhere on the planet right now. He can launch one of these tactical nukes and he can detonate them in a way that will cause an EMP. He can do that, and he can do it without having to deal with the fallout from radiation. So it's totally on the table, and it's in his calculus. And I want to comment on the unthinkable point you were making earlier, Tony. Anytime we have a leader that says a thing is unthinkable, that should trigger every free-thinking and independent-thinking American.
Absolutely.
It should really trigger that trust button, and internal trust button about that person saying that. Because if there's one thing in this country that we have, it's free thinkers, right? And the prosperity, the freedom and the prosperity that we've experienced over a couple centuries has allowed us to think deeply into the furthest depths of any given subject that we could dream up. And when someone gets on a podium and says the word unthinkable, there's two things. They're either being deliberately deceptive or they're ignorant to an absolute degree. And that should really erode your trust in that person.
Mhm.
So I'd like to make a comment about we're starting to see headlines about Russia's Air Force and their lack of engaging their Air Force in this current Ukraine conflict. So it's unthinkable, right? It's not unthinkable. All right. This is calculated. Why would he do that? And this is what I would pose to you all too. Why would he do that? I think a rational argument is economies of force. This is part of his strategy. It's part of a deliberate strategy of an economy of force to not over-engage because there's other stuff coming. There are other contingencies. There is other plans in place. So forget that unthinkable thing. That is just ignorance or deception. And start thinking about what is possible. And what is possible is that this EMP, and, you know, for that regard, a CME, right? The last one we experienced was sometime in the late 19th century, I think. And I think Ambassador.
Oh, we've had the
Cooper
Keratin
is the expert
event
here.
was a major one. But just, you know, there's been several that have happened. As a matter of fact, Toronto, I think, suffered one in the 90s, which was fairly significant. I actually testified to that to the FERC at one point. But Bill, to that point, I mean, either a coronal mass injection or a weapon of war, it's inevitable that at some point the United States could face something over our
We've
territory.
experienced this, right? We've experienced
Yeah.
this. We've had these eco-terrorists shoot up these transformers and shut down parts of
Right.
our grid before, right? And what
Yep.
ask any person from Texas who was alive during that time and they saw the fallout of people dying from carbon monoxide trying to stay warm in their garage with their car running, right? And that was, I mean, have we forgotten? You know, it's totally thinkable. So it's time to wake up and start preparing. And this is this is not a partisan issue. And to think about the money that we spend on things, this is something that we could address and really harden our grid, harden our vulnerabilities, make us far less vulnerable to this with a pretty relatively small investment, which I think the ambassador could really speak to.
If I can jump in. just a
Yeah.
second. It is to that very point. I recall reading a study not long ago, in the last, I don't know, half a dozen years, that said that we could harden basically all of our key strategic infrastructures, all of them, the 14 infrastructures, for something on the order of $100 billion. Now, which sounds like a lot of money, but the way we've been throwing money around for the last couple of years, not a lot. And the study said, if I remember correctly, about $100 billion would be the initial investment. And then it was really a remarkably small, less than $10 billion per year to keep them all modernized. Well, given that we're spending $6 trillion of the federal budget this year, I just don't think that's a lot of money.
No, it's not. And that's a great point. Yes, Hank.
Well, I was just going to add to that. We did a study in York County in South Carolina. It's where Rock Hill is, neighbor to Charlotte, those of you not familiar with the area. And Duke Energy, which is one of the nation's largest energy companies, where we worked in conjunction with them. We did an analysis of what it would cost to protect the grid for York County, which includes Rock Hill. I think it's the 4th or 5th largest city in South Carolina. Turned out it was less than $100 per citizen of that county. One-time cost and a few dollars a year after that per citizen to maintain it, as your point earlier. This was the distribution grid, which delivers electricity to the individuals. A problem in doing this is, how is that grid regulated? Well, it turns out that there's a regulatory commission in every state. So there's 50 regulatory commissions. And in South Carolina, we've got co-ops and municipal companies that manage it. So we have a maze of folks that are managing this distribution grid that delivers electricity to the people and the businesses and the schools and the hospitals and all of the key infrastructure. And then we have the bulk power grid that Duke Energy, I hope, is taking care of up in York County anyway. It's about, I don't know, 5% of the grid of York County. And it would cost a bit more probably to protect, but that's where the power plants are and the high distribution high voltage distribution lines that go across the nation's part of that. And that is regulated by a federal regulatory body, FERC. But FERC hasn't the means to carry it out. Congress has managed to design it so that there's a nonprofit NERC, the Nuclear Energy Regulatory, it's not a commission, corporation, I guess, that is really doing all the homework and whatever, how to make that happen. And when you look at their books, they're funded by the energy companies. So you have a self-licking ice cream cone that's responsible for the grid that delivers electricity from the power plants to the states. And then you've got 3,000 or so companies and whatever else that deliver it to the people. So, I mean, we just have a monstrosity on the grid, and we're doing nothing to protect it, to speak of.
So to that point, Hank, by the way, I remembered the name of your colleague, Don Linger. Don briefed
Linger,
us.
yeah.
Briefed
He
us
was with
on,
me in the 1960s, by the way.
So Don, being one of your colleagues, outlined, as I recall, boy, I'm geezing here, but this was like 2007, 8. Wow, time flies. And Don went through and laid out the way that the Russians had developed the 5th generation with, by the way, very low radiation as an outgrowth of the use. So my question to you all, this is a 2-part question. I'll throw it out to the team here. You know, I think, and I'll use the term again because I think it's cute. It'll probably get me in trouble, but based on the fact that the Russians have laid out a very clear plan, Bill, I agree with you. I think this is a very rational plan. I think they've thought through this. To Hank's point, I think we have, boy, this is not partisan, but it is, by the fact that the Democrats always seem to misread the room. They don't understand the threat. And therefore, they just start, oh, we'll solve this through diplomacy. You're not going to solve this through diplomacy because your adversary has decided a long time ago he's got a decision tree, and he's going to continue to go down that tree and push you and push you and push you until they get pushback. Otherwise, as Pete might say, they've got sequels and branches that they will execute as they go forward. And I would argue until they achieve their ultimate objectives, they're going to keep going unless someone pushes back. So with that as a backdrop, is Putin engaging in a thermonuclear lap dance, or is this serious? And is there going to be, within the context of this, because I think he would consider using, I'm going to throw it out there, what if he drops, and this is no surprise for our team because we've been talking about it, what if he decided to use a 10 to 15, a Hiroshima-sized weapon in Ukraine just because he can? What would we do? What would the West do? What would NATO do? I would argue NATO has no political will or military capacity to do much at this point. I would argue, Hank, that despite Trump saying you got to pay more, I don't think that payment went anywhere useful. I think they are fractured. I don't think there's a clear set of leaders who would be able to pull it all together. And I think Hank would agree with me on this. During the Cold War, you had to have really strong leaders who can pull together, an Eisenhower-esque leader who could pull together these countries. Boy, the biggest thing that I learned from studying Eisenhower is that he had to be a master of not only personality, but cultures. Because within Europe, the Europeans can't get along. So I would argue we don't have leadership in place to actually organize and support a NATO effort. I would argue the NATO alliance itself has not been preparing and updating like Putin. Thermobaric weapons. Thermobaric weapons are horrible. I would remember being trained on these things, or the expectation we were developing them as part of our toolkit. Those things are terrible. I'm going to ask Chris to put a link about thermobaric weapons in this. So what if Putin uses nuclear weapons, and will this escalate into something greater? So, gentlemen, what are your thoughts on this?
Well, I think I would just like to add to the question, which would color the answer a little bit, which is the fact that if he loses the ground war, because he's not doing that great at the ground war, whatever you're going to say his master plan, evil genius strategy is, the fact is that they're not doing well in the ground war. And Ukraine claims that they've killed 9,000 soldiers. That might be a little bit exaggerated, but it's pretty clear from the images we've seen that a lot of them are bogged down, some of them are mutinying. There's all kinds of funny situations going on with the ground war. And if you had a heroic victory, in essence, where the Ukraine really could turn around the ground war and do the underdog, the big underdog victory, the problem is that creates a pressure on Putin. What is he going to do? Go home and declare surrender? No, that puts a pressure on him to use the wild cards, and all these type of weapons are wild cards.
So, to that point, I'm glad you brought that up, Jay, because that's where I was going to go with this. What if he decides with Belarus to go west? Because this is we're not going to have the full gap, but we may have something that looks like it. So, and Hank, stop me if I get into some territory here I'm incorrect, but as I recall, being a young lieutenant being deployed into Germany, the first use issue, basically, we were considering first use if we were losing. Basically, as I recall, the West Germans more than anyone else was encouraging NATO to lay down a line of nuclear explosions to include nuclear demolitions in the ground. Lay down essentially a line of nuclear weapons to shut off the Russians after they came out of the Fulda Gap. First use, we were considering first use. So would we have to be back in a situation now where we consider first use if Putin decides to do something, considering the fractured nature of both our own military? I'm speaking that people may push back on that, but I don't think we're ready. And I don't think NATO's ready. So would we have to consider first use of nuclear weapons?
Well, I'll have to go check my memory banks on this. I don't recall that we ever said we would consider first use.
I know, we never said it.
We used to agree not to preclude it.
That's right.
We
But the Germans were heavily encouraging it,
a joint,
as I recall from being with the Germans.
agreement. So the Soviets had to worry about it. There's no question about it.
Yeah.
And that was very much part of the strategy in dealing with the Fulda Gap coming through, all of that. And there were lots of other technological inventions that came along with that. The neutron bomb, which actually we finally developed and had the Germans on board to deploy it. I worked closely with the guy who invented that. And then at the last minute, after we produced them, we backed out. George Bush, I believe it was, backed out of deploying the, no, it was not, it was before Reagan, it was Carter who backed away from deploying them. So, I mean, yes, we worried about nuclear weapons as a part of our strategy in defending the NATO nations, and they were very much a part of it. I mean, they agreed to deploying the INF missiles as a barrier against the Soviet SS-20s.
Right.
People forget about that. But the Soviets were deploying them at a rate of 1 or 2 a month, as I recall. And when we deployed the INF missiles in late 83 or 84, I forget exactly when, it was the lead up to the 84 elections though. And the Soviets tried very hard to get all of the elections in Europe, among those nations, and the United States to go against this issue. And that's the one time that unequivocally NATO hung together. It's a proud moment. Maggie Thatcher was Reagan's strong partner in all of that. And so, and we stood them down at that point. I hesitate to think about how that would go today. And that began, frankly, during the Carter years.
Yeah.
People forget that. It was Reagan who carried it out. And I don't know whether Carter would have, because we already mentioned Cyrus Vance was on an appeasement route, and Reagan came in and said nuts to that. We're going to change the name of the Arms Control Limitation Treaties to Arms Control Reduction Treaties, START, and we're going to ban INF missiles, and we're going to go for peace through strength. So we fundamentally changed the policy of the United States when Reagan came in, and I attribute that to our success.
So are we opening the door, gentlemen, the United States, not us? I mean, I think we here as students of Ambassador Cooper and the Reagan defense strategies understand clearly what Hank is saying, and I think would act as such. Is the United States and the Biden administration inviting nuclear catastrophe by showing constant deferral to Putin? Is this only enraging and encouraging him? And I cite for you, obviously, the refusal on the economic side to actually sanction his primary method of income, which is oil. Nobody's willing to do that. There's all sorts of exceptions. They're not actually going after his primary revenue source. Are they also encouraging it by the fact that they are ignoring the Soviet rocket force? That's a slip. The Russian rocket forces being put on high alert. They're ignoring that. They're actually not willing to do, to Hank's point, the Minutemen III. They're not willing to actually do an exercise with Minutemen III. And boy, I've said, you know, you need to be basically, because you're talking about at best 1979 technology that we're using now. Who drives a 79 Pinto? Nobody. So yet we're still depending on technology from decades ago. How is it we're not exercising that is a good thing? Is that basically signaling that we're not going to exercise? Is that only encouraging Putin? So that's the last question. I'll throw it out there for you guys to debate.
Can I chime in there?
Yeah, please.
2 points. First off, just on the issue of sanctions. Currently, the United States is buying today $70 million worth of oil per day from Russia. So there's a mixed message. But I would take a nice hard turn here on the issue of our nuclear force. There is a fundamental truth about deterrence, and that fundamental truth is the more capable your force is, the more effective your deterrence is. And the opposite is also true. As your force becomes less and less flexible, your force becomes less and less of a deterrent. What happens is your thresholds start moving up. And if, for example, I'll make it an extreme example. If all you had were 1 megaton bombs, you had nothing smaller than a 1 megaton bomb, it would have to be a very high threshold before you would decide to put a 1 megaton bomb down range.
Right.
And so what happens is that the other side sees this as an opportunity to do a whole bunch of things that runs right up to your threshold, but your threshold's much further up the ladder, as it were. And therefore, there's all sorts of other things they can do. By building a flexible, capable force, there are less things they can do, and it's more easy for us to hold them to a specific spot on, if you're a specific rung, on what is known euphemistically as the escalation ladder, and prevent them from prevent the situation from moving further up the ladder. We are, every day that we don't engage in a development of more capable, more flexible nuclear force, we are messing with that movement up the ladder. And I think that if you talk to some of the Russian planners who are advising Putin, they understand how that ladder works. More to the point, there are very few people in Washington, D.C., even in the Pentagon, who understand how that ladder works. If you go back 30 years, you go back to 1990, all through the 70s and 60s and 70s and 80s, everybody in the U.S. military had to engage in some sort of, at some level, had to engage in some sort of nuclear planning. We all discussed it. We all understood elements of it. We have spent the last 30 years with very few people playing in that arena. And there are all sorts of folks wearing stars on their shoulders who have never engaged in any of this kind of activity. And you can ask them, go look at their biographies. It's all right there. And there is, as a result, there is much less of a, if you will, a cognitive awareness of what this all means and how it needs to be dealt with. And I think
Right.
that's a very strange, dangerous place to be. And it's manifested in the fact that no one stands up and says, we need to modernize these forces, and we need to take a hard look at our defenses and things like EMP and how we defend against EMP.
I'm with you. So, and I think the next, as the audience probably knows, we're trying to put together a series of strategic recommendations to help members, the policymakers, and whoever's in the 2024, 2025 administration once the elections are happening to help inform this. But what do we do now? How do we interpret what Biden's going to do or not do? Combine that with Putin. And to remind everybody, the reason we're having this discussion today is for individuals to be prepared. We've done a number of other videos. Chris can put them in the link to this, where we talk about preparation of what to do. I don't want to go through that today. That's an entire different set, but we've talked about this. What can we expect from Putin and the Biden administration, and what should we expect?
Well, I like to make this a very important point. There's two kinds of old people. There's the Malcolm Forbes and Hugh Hefner type, and as opposed to the guy who's putt-putting along at 30 miles an hour in the passing lane on the Florida highway. Insurance companies, things like that, they assume that old people are going to be more careful just because they're old and they're nervous, and so they become more careful and more risk averse. Whereas a guy like Malcolm Forbes, whose whole life was crunching numbers, once he retired, he went crazy and embarrassed his children because in the world of numbers, it works the other way around. It's like, hey, I got very little to lose. So if I'm 90 years old, I don't want to be going 90 miles an hour. I'm going to lose 60 years, 70 years. If I'm 80 years old, what am I going to lose? A couple of years? I'm old anyway. They're not even enjoyable years. So with a guy like Putin, who is very unlikely to be succeeded by a person with his capability, for him, as he runs out of time, he wants to do something with major impact. But Biden is the exact opposite kind of old man, who is old, and he somehow made it to be president against all expectations, and he wants to, fill his 4 years and be able to, get his money and write his book, and he's more of a placeholder. So it's fascinating to see the two kind of approaches to running out of time in your life pitted against each other.
I think that's a good analogy. I think there's a great deal of truth in that, Jay. I think you've got someone who's very clearly focused on a significant legacy. I think Putin is very cognizant of what he wants for his legacy. Biden got the T-shirt, and now he's just kind of in there to put his time. Someone argued that Biden is not the guy in charge, which I find very fascinating. And if he is in charge, it's frightening by the fact he actually believes that 5 people were killed during 5 police officers were killed during the 6th of January events, which was not. And so his constant detachment from reality really worries me regarding the fact that if he's in charge, we're in trouble. If he's not in charge, we're in trouble. There's no upside here. There's really not. So anyone else want to comment before we go on this?
I would, Tony. I would say weakness invites the wolves, right? One thing we can do is start talking about this. We don't need to shelter our children from this. This needs to be a dinner table type of discussion, in my opinion. If we don't start having the discussions, we'll be forced to start having the discussions. It's time for Americans to harden up a little bit and broach these subjects and not shy away from them. Because when you look at our leadership and who's going to go and deal with this, who's going to be the Eisenhower type of leader, there's nobody on the bench. This is happening because the conditions have been met in Putin's plan, right? His conditions have been met, so he's taking Ukraine. Those conditions are an array of conditions right? But you look at our military, there's a whole lot of very competent and capable warfighters getting out before their prime because they've lost their trust and confidence in the institution. And that trend is happening across our citizenry with, American institutions. So weakness invites the wolves. We got to start hardening up. You got to make this a dinner table type of topic. Otherwise, we could be forced to be making it a dinner table type of topic.
So I interpret your comments as think the unthinkable. And I think that's what we all would agree upon here. Anyone else want to comment before we head out on this and go?
Well, 30 seconds, just to remind that, 2 months ago, we predicted that Putin may have a deal with Xi, that Xi moves on Taiwan.
Right. We did talk about that.
Yeah, so that's critical here, where that could immediately throw everything, all the calculations out the window if that happens.
So, yeah, but I think at this point, we need to, my primary task here, gentlemen, and for us and our audience is just to remember, and this is where I think we're at right now for our audience to understand, is that if he's put it on the table, he's put it on the table with a reasonable expectation that he may have to use that threat and follow through. So, Pete, Hank, anything else y'all want to add before we go?
I would just add to that thought, if he decides to do it, I think without a doubt, it's going to be with a prelude of physical cyber attack and the most horrific cyber threat there is, which is
I agree.
the
I agree. So that's it. Thank you all for joining us today for Thought to Action, where we've walked through thinking the unthinkable, of encouraging you all to consider the ramifications of Putin's threats relating to nuclear weapons, regarding the escalation of use of force, about what I see, and I think everybody on the panel sees, as the use of the demure by the Biden administration, the idea that we're going to be nice and give Putin what he wants, and this appeasement issue and diplomacy is only, I believe, inviting an escalation, if you will, of the potential conflict, and that NATO's not ready, we're not ready. And I hate to say it that way, but I think it's true. So anyway, please like, share, subscribe. Check out our other videos on Thought to Action, where we've gone in detail talking about how to be prepared for an EMP event or a nuclear weapons event where you survive, we survive. And I think it's time we all recognize that there's a legitimate existential threat that we have to face, that the decisions being made by today's leaders, both in Europe and here, are only inviting the extension of potential expansion of nuclear, of expansion of the use of military force across the globe, and that we have to be prepared no matter what. So like, share, subscribe, hit that notification bell, please comment, helps the algorithm. Follow us on Twitter, LinkedIn, Facebook, and everything else. So again, I'm Lieutenant Colonel Tony Schaefer, President of the London Center for Policy Research. Oh, and I can't forget, Teespring Store. We have merchandise now, so be sure and check that out. And please follow us and check in on us again very soon for more Thought to Action. Thank you for being here.